there was a party until very recently that was very clear about its opposition to net zero and lots of other things that very blue-collar base that you're talking about feels very strongly about. And this was summed up perfectly by a friend of the show, a friend of ours called Jeff Norcoy, a great comedian, who said...
Great comedian.
Who said, how the fuck...
Great podcast, what most people think.
Exactly. And what he said is on Twitter, how the fuck is there a civil war in a party with 5 MPs? Yeah. What the hell is going on in Reform, Liam?
Well, Reform, what's incredible, and I'll say this on your podcast because it's not said often enough. Again, I'll be accused of being a fascist for just making this observation. But in my experience, the betting markets are much better predictions of what's happening in politics and indeed lots of life than the polls and certainly the newspaper commentators. And for many months now, Reform have been favourites on many of the big betting sites to form the next government in this country. That is an astonishing fact, given that this party barely existed just before the election in July 2024. It is, of course, led by Nigel Farage, who has been on the scene of British politics for well over a decade under UKIP. One of his previous party incarnations, they won the European election in 2014, the first party to win a national election in the UK that wasn't the Tories or Labour for over 100 years. So he's an incredible he's an incredible political communicator, and while a lot of people don't like him, increasing numbers of people really like him and really like his party. But you know what? Because Nigel Farage knows that the key to Reform getting into government isn't going to, the far reaches of the British electorate on the right. What he needs to do is he needs to convince people who are previously Conservatives and people who are previously Labour to vote for him. He needs to convince them that he's not racist, that he's not an extremist, that he's not so-called far right, that he's just a grown-up. And that's why he's come to blows with another of the 5 MPs, a guy called Rupert Lowe, who's not a politician. He's a businessman. He used to be one of the owners of Southampton Football Club. He's a very successful businessman. He, like Farage, is MP for a coastal seat in the east of England, Great Yarmouth and Clacton, respectively, both seats with quite a lot of less well-off people with respect to them, quite economically marginalised. And let's be clear, Rupert Lowe is to the right of Nigel Farage, particularly on immigration. Rupert Lowe wants to deport lots of people, which is what AfD wants to do in Germany. And Nigel Farage thinks that's a bit strong. That's a bit strong for a mainstream political party in the UK. And that is what the essence of this rift between them is about.
Is it?
Yep.
Because a lot of people will say it's about ego. And
of course it's about ego. But that is the hill they've decided to fight.
Difference?
I mean, we've had policy and ego is all tied up in politics, isn't it?
Sure. We've had both Rupert and Nigel on the show. I think the thing about deporting people, I'm pretty sure Rupert wants to deport illegal immigrants.
Yeah.
So why is that an issue? Don't we all want illegal immigrants deported?
I think a lot of people do, but I think mainstream British politics isn't capable of coping with that.
Really?
Yeah, I do.
But isn't that, I'm an immigrant.
Yeah.
I want illegal, I don't think people should come here legally and then be allowed to stay.
It doesn't make any sense. It's all about degrees, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, if you've just arrived, then I think it is increasingly becoming a mainstream thing to do what Australia did, which is to have third country processing and so on. I think there's quite a lot of support among the silent majority for that. But I think the distinction between Nigel Farage and Rupert Lowe is, when. Because under the British rules, if you've been here for 5 years, you're almost certain to get what we call leave to remain. You become normalised. And that's the way we've been coping with the influx of illegal immigration. We've just been letting those people sit there and then eventually there's some kind of amnesty in effect and they have their papers normalised even though they came here illegally. And that's why so many do. That's the model, isn't it? That's why they risk their lives doing this crazy thing of going across the busiest shipping lane in the world, which is subject to all kinds of squalls and weather surges, which is the English Channel, right? It's only 21 miles, but as we've seen, lots of people have died. But Rupert is much, much more adamant that people should be deported,
even if they've been here like 20 years. Is what
I
you're
wouldn't. He hasn't put a number on it. It's all about adjectives and degrees and so on. But of course, eventually it's about ego. And everyone knows in politics that if you take on Nigel Farage, he will find a way to beat you. He is the ultimate political street fighter. There are a lot of people in politics and parts of the media that are very loyal to him. I personally think Rupert Lowe is a decent man. I think he's conducted himself very, very well. I think he's a very talented orator. I think it's great we're getting, talented business people giving up their time to come into politics. In many ways, I applaud him. But I think he's been a little bit naive thinking that the way to take on Nigel is to go to the papers and moan about Nigel. That is not the way to take on Nigel Farage. And, in the end, yes, Rupert Lowe's popular on Twitter, or X, as we must now call it, of course, but he doesn't have nearly the following in the country that Farage does. Farage is a national figure because he's been doing this for so long. Rupert Lowe is getting, great feedback on X with a couple of 100,000 followers. But, if people walk down the street, then, with Rupert Lowe, very few people are going to know who he is. Walk down the street with Nigel Farage, as I've done many times. We've been broadcast a lot together on GB News and elsewhere. I've known him for many, many years as a journalist. Walk down the street with Nigel Farage and you'll be mobbed. And years ago,
undeniable.
It would have been largely abuse. Now, in my experience, the majority of people that come up to him, they want a selfie with him. They want to shake his hand. Young people. He's got this huge following on TikTok. He's the only mainstream British politician that actually has used TikTok. And so, with huge respect to Rupert Lowe, I think he's bitten off more than he can chew.
It's interesting you say that, because the concern for a lot of people isn't, look, I say this with all respect to both men. I don't care about Nigel Farage. I don't care about Rupert Lowe. I don't care about reform. I don't care about the Conservative Party. I don't care about the Labour Party. I don't care about the Lib Dems. I care about the country. And the concern for a lot of people, with this is the following. Forget about Rupert Lowe and Nigel Farage. If this is how Nigel runs a party, I'm not saying this is my position, by the way. I believe in strong leadership, and I think people have to follow the leader as much as that's possible. But the concern for a lot of people that I'm hearing is, well, if Nigel Farage can't run a party of 5 MPs, how is he going to run a party of 200 MPs? And if the moment anyone, challenges the way things are done, they get what's Rupert's had, which by many people's reckoning is unfair treatment, being accused of things that you may or may not have done, and also, pretty nasty stuff. One of the things that people are putting now, he's got early onset dementia. This is pretty low grade shit. You wouldn't enjoy someone saying that about you or me or anyone else, right? So the concern for people who don't care about the personalities but care about the country is, how is reform going to be a credible challenge to the two mainstream parties, which they have a real shot of doing?
Oh, definitely.
If they can't keep 5 people on the same fucking team.
I agree with you. It's pretty edifying. There's a lot of people in the media, a lot of professional political observers, they're pretty disappointed because reform have been going so well. They've been connecting with parts of the electorate they weren't previously connecting with, and now they're having this ridiculous Mexican standoff, right? Having said that, with huge respect, I do think that's a kind of bubble view, which is uncharacteristic on this podcast, because you guys are so good at getting out beyond the bubble. 2 or 3% of the country have even heard of Rupert Lowe. That's the reality. Now, I'm not saying that among his supporters, he hasn't got at least some of the electricity that Nigel Farage has. He has. I've seen it. I've been, as a journalist.
But Liam, I'm making a different point.
As a journalist, I've been to reform rallies, right?
No, I understand, but I'm making a different point.
Most voters out there, for them, reform is Nigel Farage, and they're going to vote for Nigel Farage anyway.
Agreed.
However much the Westminster bubble throws at reform for being dysfunctional.
But the argument is different. My argument is different, which is, as this thing carries on, reform have less than 4 years now, around 4 years until the next election. They're going to have a party of 300 people, some of whom are going to be the Rupert Lowes and etc. How is the concern for, I think, a lot of people who are paying attention? Yes, I understand Nigel is huge in the country. He is, undoubtedly, and Rupert isn't, understood. But how is a party that reacts this way to any challenge to the current structure going to manage that situation, if they're going to be a credible alternative?
I think that's the test. I think most voters don't care about a rift. And obviously, if Rupert Lowe continues to be a thorn in Farage's side, tries to set up another party or whatever, then, that will be a pain in Nigel Farage's backside. But is the media going to carry on reporting it? Is it going to become an old story? We'll see. It's all to play for. Rupert Lowe may get a load of money behind him, and he may cause a big noise, and you may have some massive split in Reform, and a lot of the political establishment would love that to happen, and they're flaming the fans of that, and desperately trying to make it happen. But your fundamental point is absolutely correct, though. They have to professionalise. And that is what I'm seeing they are trying to do to at least some extent. So they've brought in a young Sri Lankan chairman who's a very successful business leader, Zia Youssef. He's part of this row between Nigel and Rupert, trying to get Rupert out for whatever internecine reason. But as well as doing that, Zia Youssef and his team are doing a mass screening of candidates. They're going to run candidates in each of the 650 constituencies. They're taking premises in a lot of the constituencies, building constituency offices. I'm seeing that in the part of the country where I live, very much a Tory stronghold, where Reform are really putting down deep roots. There are lots of defections at the local level. And I would say, I hold no candle for Reform, right? I've never pinned my colour to any I've never pinned my colours to any political party. It's not really in my nature. But I would suggest that Reform, they're 5 MPs. Yes, they got 5 MPs only, but they got 14% of the vote, right, in July 2024 in the general election. The Lib Dems got 71 seats on 11% of the vote. This is our weird voting system. Reform have 5 MPs now. Maybe they're going to have 4 if Rupert Lowe leaves. But by the time of the next election in 2029, if that's when it is, they'll have 10 or 15 because of defections and because of by-elections. By-elections, when MPs die or resign in between general elections. And in our system, there's a one-off election in one constituency that the whole political class focuses on for a week. So I think they are going to build their support in Parliament. I think they're going to go from 10 to 15 MPs. Once they go to 6 MPs, they get something what we call short money, which is a Westminster Convention. They get money to actually help them be an opposition party. They are screening candidates like crazy. I know that Zia and Nigel and Deputy Leader Richard Tice are absolutely focused on getting a candidates list that is shorn of, quotes, the nutters, because so many crazy people are attracted to new political parties. So let's see. Look, I still don't think the political mainstream realises what's happening. They haven't clocked the fact that on the betting markets, Reform they're not odds on, but they're favourites to be form the next government. That is an incredible thing. And when we look what's happening across Western Europe, it isn't unusual. AfD could easily win the 2029 election in Germany. They just came second, doubling their vote. They're being shut out by the SPD, who just got their lowest vote ever, and they're still going to be in government if indeed Merz of the CDU and the SPD can actually form some kind of coalition. I'm not sure that they will. We'll see. But this is happening across Western Europe. I think the UK is slightly behind, and our form of, hard right party, if you like, is always going to be a bit more moderate than that, because I think we are just generally a more moderate country than the French, the Germans, certainly than the Italians and the Spanish and the Greeks.
Thank God for that.
But I do think Reform are coming, and they're coming hard. And I think these squalls and this internal war is because everyone can see, crikey, we could be in government, and the prizes are coming into view. And so that the venal politics and, as you say, the egos, the clashes are getting more intense.